Ronald Reagan went to Mississippi in 1980 and stood in front of a crowd and said, "I believe in states' rights." Now that sentence gets a whole lot more interesting when you find out a year later, Republican strategist Lee Atwater was recorded explaining why states' rights had become such useful political language. And I mean, he explains it. He explains how you go from openly using the N-word to states' rights to forced busing. And then eventually you get so abstract that you don't have to mention Black people at all. That's not me interpreting what Republicans meant. That's Lee Atwater explaining how the language worked. And once I heard that tape, I went back to Reagan, because I haven't told you where in Mississippi he said that. He said it in Philadelphia, Mississippi. And if you know anything about the civil rights movement, you probably already know why that matters. 16 years earlier, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner were in Neshoba County for Freedom Summer. Chaney was Black, Goodman and Schwerner were white. They were helping register Black voters, and they'd gone to investigate the burning of a Black church. They were arrested, but they were released later that night. And then they disappeared. Their burned-out car was found, but they weren't. 44 days later, investigators found their bodies buried 15 feet deep inside an earthen dam, is what they call it, which was under construction on a local farm. They'd been murdered by Klansmen in a conspiracy that included local law enforcement. So that's where Reagan is 16 years later talking about states' rights. And there's been an argument ever since about what he actually meant by it. Was it racist? Or was he just talking about the federal government? Did the location actually matter? Now, I can give you my opinion, but I don't really need to. Because a year later, Lee Atwater explained how this kind of language actually works. In 1981, a political scientist named Alexander Lamise interviews Lee Atwater about Republican politics in the South. Now, Atwater isn't just some random campaign staffer. He would eventually run George H.W. Bush's presidential campaign, and then he became the chairman of the Republican National Committee, the RNC. He's very much in the room. And when the conversation gets to race, Atwater starts explaining how the language changed. So after listening to him, I started going backwards. Because if Atwater is right about how language changed, you should be able to see that change happening. And you can, actually. Go back to 1948. Harry Truman pushes the civil rights reform and desegregates the military. And Southern segregationists in his own party are furious. Strom Thurmond breaks away from the Democrats and eventually runs for president as a Dixiecrat. And just so we're clear, the Dixiecrats weren't being subtle. They were explicitly defending segregation. And by the way, Dixiecrats was just the nickname. The party's official name was States' Rights Democratic Party. The language hadn't needed to change yet. Now, keep going. LBJ signs the Civil Rights Act, and Barry Goldwater, the Republican presidential nominee, had voted against it. Election night comes and Goldwater gets destroyed, absolutely demolished nationally. But look at what he wins. 6 states. Arizona, his home state, and then Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. 5 states in the Deep South. These are states that have been overwhelmingly Democratic for generations, and now they're voting Republican for the candidate who opposed the Civil Rights Act. And Strom Thurmond, he switches to the Republican Party that same year. Now, everybody didn't suddenly switch parties in 1964, right? That's not what happened. That realignment took decades. But something is moving. And by 1970, Republican strategist Kevin Phillips is already talking about where he thinks it's going. Phillips talks to the New York Times about what's happening in Southern politics. And basically, he says that as Black voters became increasingly Democratic in the South, white voters are going to move Republican. Which is important because this isn't somebody 50 years later trying to reconstruct what happened. He's watching it happen, and 10 years later, Reagan goes to Mississippi. And now we're back where we started. And once you know what Atwater was describing, Reagan's politics become really interesting to go back through. The welfare queen is probably one of the cleanest examples, because there really was a woman behind that story, Linda Taylor. And yeah, she committed some serious fraud. But Reagan takes this one woman and turns her into something much bigger politically. She's supposedly living this lavish lifestyle while everyone else is paying for it. And Reagan never has to say Black woman. He doesn't need to. Welfare does the work. The stereotype does the rest. And now I understand what Atwater meant by abstract. You don't necessarily need to name the group anymore. You can name something that people already associate with the group, and then let them fill in the blank. And Reagan gives you other things to look at too. of course. He'd opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He opposed the Voting Rights Act when it passed in 1965. His administration got into the fight over tax exemptions for racially discriminatory private schools. He initially rejected making MLK's birthday a federal holiday. He vetoed sanctions against apartheid South Africa. Congress overrode him, of course. Now, if that doesn't tell us what Reagan thought about Black people, I don't know what does. But then I found something from 2005 that makes this even harder to argue around. Kevin Mellman is the chairman of the RNC, and he goes to speak to the NAACP, and he acknowledges that some Republicans had tried to benefit politically from racial polarization. And then he says, "We were wrong." Now, that was the point where I stopped looking, because what else am I looking for? I have the electoral map. I have Republican strategists talking about the movement of white Southern voters while it's happening. I have Lee Atwater on tape explaining why racial language became more abstract. And then I have the chairman of the Republican Party acknowledging that Republicans tried to benefit from racial polarization. So go back to Reagan, Mississippi. I believe in states' rights. Do I know exactly what was going through Reagan's head when he said it? No. But I also don't think that's the most interesting question anymore, because Atwater gave us a better one. If political language becomes more effective when you don't explicitly mention race, then why are we still waiting for politicians to mention race before we're willing to recognize racial politics? That was the whole point of taking the word out.